It's my great pleasure to introduce Jessica Harris, who has many claims to fame. Most importantly, she is a member of our advisory board, the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival's advisory board, a person that I turn to often for help and advice. And if you know Jessica, what you know about her is that she always responds, and she always responds in the most gracious and thoughtful way. And she's busily writing a new book, so is a little bit tied up, but she took the time to be here today, and I want to particularly thank her for doing that. Jessica's the author of 12 critically acclaimed books documenting the food and the foodways of the African diaspora. Most recently, her book, High on the Hog, A Culinary Journey from Africa to America, was turned into a documentary film with Stephen Satterfield, 4-part. I think it helped us all get through COVID and was quite fabulous. She was in the book festival a few years ago with her memoir, My Soul Looks Back, and she is the recipient of a James Beard Lifetime Achievement Award. And it's all happened, many of those things have happened in the last year for Jessica. So with that, Jessica, thank you so much for being here, and I happily turned it over to you.
Whoa, there are a lot of you. Good afternoon. I promise to be brief because, we need to get on to what we're getting onto. I'm going to say two things. One is, when Sue Ellen asks, there's only one answer. Yes. So, good afternoon. I am simply here to present the people who will be in conversation this afternoon, one of whom truly needs no introduction, and one of whom has written a tome on a subject that's quite close to my heart. The first one is Mark Bittman, and you all know Mark Bittman. He's one of the country's best-known and most widely respected food writers. He's the author of over 30 books, and I, who am laboring with one, know what that means, including his How to Cook Everything series, which, with 1 million copies in print, are a mainstay of the modern kitchen. He was one of the leading, or actually the leading food columnist for the New York Times for over 30 years. His many accolades include 6 James Beard Awards. Mr. Bittman is currently Special Advisor on Food Policy at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health, where he teaches and hosts a lecture series called Food, Public Health, and Social Justice. His new book, Animal, Vegetable, Junk, A History of Food from Sustainable to Suicidal, which the New York Times calls a comprehensive treatise on humanity's relationship to food that matches the moment, is quite extraordinary. In Mr. Bittman's own words, you can't talk about agriculture without talking about the environment, he writes. You can't talk about animal welfare without talking about the welfare of food workers, and you can't talk about food workers without talking about income inequality, racism, and immigration. So please welcome Mark Bittman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Bittman will be in conversation with Danielle Dreilinger. Now, her subject is dear to my heart because my mother actually had a degree in home economics and was a dietitian. She got her degree from Pratt in the 1930s. Ms. Dreilinger lived in New Orleans, is moving to Raleigh, and in New Orleans she had been the education reporter for the New Orleans Times-Picayune, covering their contentious charter school revolution. Prior to that, she lived in Boston, where she produced WGBH's local news website and wrote for the Boston Globe about gentrification, diversity, and politics. She is the author of The Secret History of Home Economics, How Trailblazing Women Harnessed the Power of Home and Changed the Way We Live. In her rave review for the book, Ann Hood writes, Danielle Dreilinger's The Secret History of Economics is a revelation. That secret history is rich with gender and race issues and opened the eyes of this former home ec student. It will open yours too. So please welcome Danielle Dreilinger and Mark Bittman. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your lovely introduction, Dr. Harris. So we're just going to give Mark an opportunity to talk about and argue about and maybe defend a little his compelling and argumentative tome that I'm sure many of you guys have already read. So to start with, what is just the main premise, the main point and argument that you're making?
I mean, I set out to write this book, and as you all know, things change. So I set out to write this book 5 years ago. It feels a little bit like, and I finished it last July, a year ago. So it feels a little bit like a different world. But the two main questions the book raises, or I wanted it to raise, are what is food for? And I think we can explore that a little bit. And why do people discount food so much? Why don't people take food more seriously? So I'll talk about each for a second. To take the second one first, everybody talks about food all the time. It's not like food is not on people's minds. Vernon was just saying to me, oh, my mother was such a great cook. My problem is that I love to eat too much, and everybody can relate to this. People are always thinking about where their next meal is coming from, and as a result, there are a couple generations of food writers who've made a living thanks to all of that. But we don't often think about where food comes from and the impact that it has on our bodies and on the environment and on our fellow humans and on our fellow species, or we haven't thought about those things. We are thinking about them more and more, just like we're thinking about the impact of everything that we do more and more. But given how critical food is, it's funny that, and now that I say this, you're going to notice it. When people talk about the burning issues facing us today, food and agriculture are almost never on that list. They almost never make it to the list of climate change, income inequality, environmental destruction, racism, gender discrimination. Infrastructure, people will, healthcare, go on and on about the problems facing, the challenges facing us today, the things we need to fix, the things that need our attention, COVID, for example, and food and agriculture rarely get onto that list. Yet, the kind of diet that American agriculture is responsible for, the sort of standard American diet, sometimes called SAD, is responsible for more deaths annually than COVID was last year, will be this year, and certainly will be next year. Barring catastrophe, as I've learned to say repeatedly. So food is a big issue. That's one point of animal vegetable junk. And the other is to just get people to ask, what is food for? Because if I say, what is food for, your kind of glib or simple or reflexive answer is, well, to feed people. I mean, you might say to feed people and other species. You might take it a little farther and to say to feed people and other species while doing as little damage as possible. That's pretty good. That takes it pretty far down the road. And yet what food is really for in the United States is to make money. It's to make profit. Land is owned for profit. Crops are grown for profit. Food is produced, sold, marketed, and so on for profit. And that is the number one job of people who control food. Not to nourish us. Food implies nourishment. Nourishment implies promoting health. And yet agriculture is done in a destructive manner. More than half of the food that's produced in the United States is considered unhealthy. Literally more than half, 60%. And that's not nourishment. That makes food, much of that food closer in dictionary definition to poison. So if we stop now, not that we will, but if we stop now and I said, just go think about what food's for and put it on your list of important things to think about, I feel like I'd have done my job. But we can expand on it a little bit.
Right. And actually, to follow up on that point a bit, one of the points you make in your book is that enormous quantities of crops in the United States are not even grown for food, they're grown for ethanol, which was really shocking.
Yeah, a third of the corn in Iowa gets turned into ethanol, which is not even particularly fuel efficient and is heavily subsidized by the federal government so that we are paying to grow an environmentally damaging crop that then produces an environmentally damaging and not particularly efficient fuel so that the people involved in that business can make money. It's almost a direct payment to energy companies and corn farmers.
So plenty of people have railed against agribusiness, or plenty of people, if you have read all the books that I've read, that I'm guessing many of you have read. But what really startled me in your book is the argument that you make that that just agriculture itself, switching from hunting and gathering and to agriculture was, some would say, you're right, some would say it's the most disastrous change in the history of the species. And I just wanted, how is that the case? I thought that's what created writing, without which we wouldn't be here.
Well, none of us would be here without agriculture. This is not an argument that's original to me. Jared Diamond first made this argument in a piece called, I think it's called Agriculture, the Biggest Mistake in the History of the Human Race. And then Harari in Sapiens, also called Agriculture, a Huge Mistake. I just wanted to bring up that argument. I don't want to subscribe to that argument or further that argument. It's an interesting argument. 10,000 years ago, roughly, people already knew how to put seeds in the ground and watch plants grow. And people already knew how to herd animals into maybe a dead-end valley or near a cliff where they could be contained and domesticate them and take advantage of their wool or their eggs or their milk, whatever. What they didn't do until about 10,000 years ago is say, these are my plants. I'm growing them. You can't forage them. So if you forage them, we have to fight about that. Or these are my animals. I'm breeding them. You can't hunt them. They're mine. So that was the beginning of agriculture and the beginning of civilization. And without that, none of us would exist, because population on Earth at that time was something like 50 million. It's now whatever it is, close to 8 billion. And all of that is due to this spiraling food supply and need to keep the food supply up that started 10,000 years is a very short time. Even humans have been around for 200,000, and the Earth's been around for 4 billion. So this is a blink of an eye. In this blink of an eye, our population has multiplied by over 100-fold, and our food production has gone with it. Hunters and gatherers don't really need large families. In fact, large families are problematic if you're carrying your children while you're hunting and gathering. But farmers need lots of children because they need that free labor. And as a result, the more food there was, the more children there were. The more children there were, the more food was needed. Agriculture grew and grew and grew and grew and grew. So is that a problem or not? Well, it kind of doesn't matter. But here we are. But I think what's important, and Danielle and I talked before, I can't remember whether this is on your list or not, but I'll just do this. There are 3 or 4, or however you want to count them, numbers of turning points in the past 10,000 years that weren't, given that agriculture existed. It wasn't inevitable that we wound up with this kind of agriculture. And when I say this, I mean just let your mind flash on the word Iowa, and that's what I'm talking about. thousands and thousands of acres of a single crop, all fed with chemicals, no other living species allowed, particularly giant barns that aren't open to anybody, filled with tens or hundreds of thousands of animals, all imprisoned and tortured on a daily basis. That's what modern agriculture looks like. And it is what exists, but it wasn't inevitable. One could imagine other things having happened. Had European nobility not chosen to turn food crops into a profitable, tradable thing, that was a turning point. Had the Europeans not started to run short of food and land and decided to conquer the world, that was a turning point. Had they not successfully conquered the world, that was a turning point. Had they had any sense of justice or fairness when they began to conquer the world, that was a turning point. And had they not invented, and it was close, had they not invented chemical fertilizer about 100 years ago, that was a turning point, because without chemical fertilizer, you couldn't have Iowa, and you would have had to figure out how to do agriculture in a way that was more in harmony with the earth, more, not necessarily traditional, but which took the knowledge and advice of tradition and the wisdom of tradition and respected that, instead of saying all those peasants didn't know how to conquer nature, we figured this out. Well, we see from climate change and environmental destruction and land grabbing and even income inequality that we haven't figured this out, and we have to figure it out now. This is another turning point. We're at another turning point. Every speaker here is going to say we're at a turning point from their perspective, and that's not because it's a fun thing to say, but because it's actually true that we are at a juncture in history where if we don't start to fix things, we're in even deeper trouble than we are. So I guess the summary of that little thing is that what's happened with agriculture has not been destiny. It's been a series of events that have led us to this place, and we now need to figure out a series of events that will lead us to a better place, because the status quo is not acceptable. It's a pipe dream to think, it's not a pipe dream to think that we can make positive change in this country and in this world. It's a pipe dream to think that the status quo is acceptable and manageable and sustainable, because it's not.
So among the steps that you chronicle in this, spiral towards the bottom, are many times when the USDA, organization that I researched with, because it housed the Bureau of Home Economics, were also complicit in some of this. You had times when the USDA failed to protect farmers, certainly small farmers, failed to regulate production, and generally sided with profit and industry and chemical companies and so on. But there were also people who pushed back about this. So I was hoping that you could talk about some of the black farmer resistance movements over time.
Well, there were resistance movements, not only on the part of black farmers, on the part of indigenous people, and on the part of, even to some extent, on the part of white people. But I think it's more important I do think it's more important to set the record straight on how land distribution, how inequality, wealth inequality happened in the first place. And a lot of that has to do with USDA, and a lot of that happened after, in the years following the defeat of Reconstruction, or the overturn of Reconstruction, when land was being given away in the United States. And the land, much of this is elementary. Land was obviously stolen from indigenous people, but it was stolen on behalf of the federal government. I mean, some of it was stolen individually, but most of it was claimed in treaties, many of which are not respected by the federal government, and then given away by the federal government thanks to the Homestead Act or in other ways, whereby almost exclusively white men, almost exclusively of European descent, were given big plots of land for free, at the expense of course, indigenous people, and without taking into account enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, descendants of enslaved people, all of whom are, or should be, full citizens of this country. So the resistance is important, but the resistance has largely been unsuccessful, and what we have is a largely white supremacist country that's being actively defended as a white supremacist country, and that begins with wealth and land. And this is a philosophical argument, and there are probably people here better equipped. There are certainly people here better equipped to have this conversation than I. But white supremacy grew out of economic need and out of, for want of a better term, capitalism. Capitalism was not the result of white people saying, we're better than everybody else, therefore we're going to make an economic system that runs the world. The economic system that created slavery needed justification, and that justification was, we're holier than thou. We are the master race, for want of a better term. And that's what we have to resist now. There has been resistance in the past, and other people will speak about that today and tomorrow. But they'll also speak about, and I want to say, the resistance is important now, and if you see food, agriculture, and land as important issues, and you talk about justice and fairness in food, in nutrition, in agriculture, in land, then you are talking about justice in race, in income inequality, in gender, in immigration, in environment, environmental protection. You're talking about, I like to call it ecology. You are talking about the oneness of all of us, and the oneness of all of us and the earth. So
is that all?
Is that all? But I mean, it's funny to be at a thing where, it's fun and funny to be at a thing where 20 or 25, however many of us there are, and we're not a self-selected group, but it's not a stretch to say that the festival has a progressive bent. But we all come at this place from different places, and everybody we've heard and everybody we're gonna hear comes to a sort of similar conclusion, which is that we need to act. We need to see that issues all are intertwined. We're in deep trouble. Much of that trouble takes the form, or is at least right now taking the form of white supremacy, and an important struggle is against that. But no matter where you come from, whether it's food or a history of home economics or making chairs, if you think it through, you're going to come to these same kind of conclusions. So perhaps a stretch, but yeah.
So you're looking at what to do about all of this. I want to talk a little bit about like personal change versus personal change for bigger changes. And my antenna were up reading through the book and reading about junk food and real food, because there is a lot of food shaming and guilting in this realm. Falls especially hard on women, falls even harder on people who are feeding children, which are usually mothers. And it's easy to be in a place, I think, where you think about eating an Oreo, and you feel bad, first of all, because, oh, it's empty calories, it's sugar, it'll make me fatter, fat is bad, it might contribute to heart disease is bad. And on top of that, oh, and also it's destroying the earth because this is all fructose, high fructose corn syrup, and this is ultra processed, and I shouldn't eat this. On the other hand, then I don't know about all of you guys, but when I'm told, even if I'm telling myself I shouldn't eat something, suddenly I want to eat it. And, if you have your 5-year-old who's, screaming, or, the restriction promotes eating disorders later on in the whole 9 yards. So where do you think the balance lies between personal changes and trying to do bigger changes? Where should we be putting our energy?
I mean, that's the key question, and yeah, we should spend some time on that. Let's see. The first thing to say is we can only eat what there is to eat. We can only eat what's in the market. And if I say, and I said, 60% of the food that's out in the world, in the United States, is ultra-processed food, is junk, and that's the right number, 60%. I'm convinced that's the right number. That either means that 60% of us are getting 100% of our calories from junk food, or 100% of us are getting 60% of our calories from junk food, or, as is the truth, somewhere in between. Some people eat very little junk food. Some people eat really a lot of junk food. We all eat some junk food. It's inevitable. Mm-hmm. We all also know that we've been trained since birth. We are hardwired to eat sugar and salt and fat. We are also hardwired to eat pretty much as much food as we can get our hands on. And now we are all trained from birth to see those foods not in their natural form, but in the form of what are called CPGs, consumer product goods, ultra-processed food, fast food, junk food, whatever you want to call it. So if the easiest way, the most convenient way for you to get your calories is at a drive-through, you are going to be eating ultra-processed food. If the easiest way to get your calories is in the freezer case, you're going to be eating ultra-processed food, and so on. That would be bad enough that 60% of the calories available to us are junk food. But the fact is that there's a virtually unlimited marketing budget, which, by the way, is tax deductible to food companies and therefore subsidized in a big way. There's a virtually unlimited marketing budget that teaches us from the moment we're born and before that Coke is the coolest drink that there is, that Tony the Tiger is our friend, that that Doritos are the most fun snack food, and that McDonald's is the place you want your parents to take you to on Sunday afternoon when you're driving around. And how many iterations on that? 1,000, 1,000,000, whatever. And we all know there isn't a person in this room who doesn't know the difficulties of denying themselves the Oreo that they were taught as children that they want. I mean, it's a meme in a way to say, well, I struggle with food issues, but anyone who starts to think about, well, I'd like to have a better diet than the diet I'm eating now, which is most of us, knows that it's not as simple as saying I'd like to have a diet than the better diet than the, because the food that's out there doesn't support, for most of us, doesn't support a good diet, and because our heads are in a place where when we're happy or sad or in any way emotionally vulnerable, we want pizza or ice cream.
Bored.
We want that, or bored, right? Anything. We want pizza. We want ice cream. We want a hot dog. We want Doritos. We want whatever it is we want. And then you throw onto that, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some layers, but then you throw into that not everybody can afford to have the same choices as most of the people sitting in this room. So some people can say, well, I'm not eating any more junk food, and it doesn't mean they're not struggling, but it might mean that they go to the farmer's market here and they buy like the best possible food. Money is no object. They buy that stuff, they put it in the refrigerator, they lock themselves in their house, and they only eat that stuff for a week. At the end of the week, they got to do it again, but okay, they can do that but not everybody can do that. And some people are like, I got to go to the drive-thru, or I got to go to the bodega, or whatever, and that's not an insignificant number of people in this country. And so we have what amounts to a public health crisis. I said at the beginning, more people are dying of diet-related chronic disease every year than of anything else, including COVID. Not of everything else put together. It's not quite that bad, but of everything else, including COVID, a minimum of 500,000 people. Some people say 1.5 million people. Like all statistics, you can find what you want to find, but a lot of people die from diet-related chronic disease in the United States every year. It's the #1 killer. And I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. This is why asking ourselves the question, what is food for? And asking ourselves the question, why don't we rank food and agriculture higher up in our concerns is a very real. Why isn't this a crisis? If something kills 500,000 people a year, COVID's a crisis. Why isn't the way we eat a crisis? And the way we eat, I can't say this enough, is determined by agriculture. It's determined by what we grow, how we process that food, how we put that food into the market, where it is, how accessible it is, how affordable it is. And the best food is the hardest food to find and the least affordable and accessible food in this country. There's an argument that we could turn that around. We're subsidizing the worst kind of agriculture and the worst kind of food. We, the United States, could subsidize the best kind of agriculture and the best kind of food. That's not going to happen overnight, but one question I need to answer, so I need to be asked, is what are we supposed to do right now?
Right. As many of us, we prioritize individual decisions because that's what we feel we can control, and because American society always is about individual responsibility. But, arguably, probably actually inarguably, that creates a better fed, healthier elite without actually changing the environment for most of the people in the country. So yeah, instead of, if we can take the energy that we're putting on whether we eat the Oreo, what should we be doing with that energy instead to actually create change?
Right. Well, I mean, saying to people, don't eat the Oreo or fix your diet, get exercise and eat better foods, is kind of like, saying, use public transportation when there is no public transportation, or ride a bike when there's no bike lanes, or when people don't have bikes. You have to make the environment so that these things are possible. So I would say in the long run, the answer is treat food as a public utility, subsidize good agriculture, not bad agriculture, subsidize good food, make sure it's affordable and available to everybody, and that will make things, that's a snap. We are nowhere near any of that happening. I mean, I'm not an idiot. So that's exactly the question. Where do we put our energies now? And again, I think this argument intersects with arguments that so many other speakers are making this weekend, because it amounts to Francis Moore LePay says, hunger isn't a food issue, it's a democracy issue. These are democracy issues. This is, who started their talk yesterday talking about we the people? Barbara. It's up to us to fix this, and that's where our energies need to go. So I don't need to talk about defending voting rights, because that's not my department. But that's right. It's right that we need to defend voting rights. But let's just talk about, we'll take food as a separate thing and say, what are the things, what are, say, 5 or 4 or 8 things, I'll just rattle some off, that could be done in the next 3 or 5 years or even months that would lead us to a place where we could envision where the next steps would be in making a better food system. So it doesn't sound like a big thing, but the absolute priority in some ways, because it's easy, and the FDA could do it if the FDA had a commissioner, and that commissioner had will and brains. would be to take antibiotics out of the food supply. So 80% of all antibiotics in the United States are used in raising animals industrially. The reasons we should not be raising animals industrially are many and well discussed elsewhere, but it would be much more difficult to do that if we took the routine use. So animals are given antibiotics in order to prevent disease and to promote growth. And the reason that's desirable on the part of producers is because they're in such miserable conditions and they're so crowded that without the antibiotics they would drop dead within days or weeks. And furthermore, those antibiotics breed bacteria that are resistant to other antibiotics, making antibiotics less effective on humans. So many of us have had the experience of having an antibiotic-resistant infection, or maybe even have known someone, because tens of thousands of people per year die of antibiotic-resistant infections that could have been treated by antibiotics a generation ago, but can't be now because the new generations of bacteria are too powerful. That's a direct result of feeding animals antibiotics. Similarly, we need to enforce existing laws and create new, more powerful laws regulating the use of chemicals in agriculture. Right now, anyone can go into a hardware store anywhere and buy carcinogens and agents of death in general and spread them on their land and make themselves or their land or their children or their farm workers, in many cases, sick. And that's a direct result of using chemicals in agriculture. Similarly, if we get back to animal production, the amount of pollution, carcinogens, and so on that comes off of the production of 10 billion animals a year in the United States, and that's how many we raise and kill every year, 10 billion. There are, interestingly, more chickens raised in the United States than there are birds in the world, wild birds, every year. So that's the kind of numbers we're talking about. That kind of animal production not only affects everybody's environment, not only produces meat you probably don't want to eat, not only raises animals in a way you can't possibly want to think about, but also creates environments around these animal production facilities that create many public health emergencies in those areas. And needless to say, those mini environments where those animals are raised are often counties with majority people of color and or majority people of lower income. That's where these animal factories are placed. That's where the environmental hazards are greatest. What else? Well, to talk about local action, it's important that our kids eat better school lunches. We know what better means. We have some control over that on a local level. It's also important that we have take some control over how our cities and our towns procure food, because every city and town is running some kind of basically public food agency, whether it is a school system or a prison or a hospital or some other kind of cafeteria. Decisions are made about how those foods are procured, and one can imagine, and indeed this is already happening, one can imagine a system that says we want 50% of our food to be grown within 100 miles of here. We don't want any slave labor involved in the production of any of our food. We want to make sure everybody who's producing our food is making twice minimum wage, whatever your town wants to say what it is. We want to make sure that X percent of our food is organic. We want to make sure that our children are eating fruits and vegetables instead of mini pizzas and frozen tacos and so on. So that's 5, and I want to, and the 6th, I mean, there are others. And even those are hard enough to achieve. But they're not unimaginable. It's not impossible. They're not laughable. And the sixth is to continue to push a conversation about reparations to indigenous people, especially to indigenous people and descendants of enslaved Americans. And the reparations are not only about land, but the reparations are in large part about land. And the federal government has the power to, had the power to give away that land, and the federal government has the power to redistribute that land. Now that's a long-term project, but we are seeing more than the beginnings of that conversation. We're seeing the beginnings of action on that conversation. And yeah, I guess I'll stop there. Do you mean 5 minutes and we're done, or 5 minutes until we should start questions?
We should probably start questions within 2 minutes.
Let's-
Right, and
Why
if
don't you ask me
All
another
right,
question?
so we should,
You can have 10 more minutes.
for everything, okay, so let's.
So if you have questions,
Come up to
go
the,
to
the microphone, please.
because we're streaming.
Right, and if you guys have not taken notes of his recommendations, I will tweet them out afterwards. I'm at DJ Dreilinger, so you can remember it's your to-do list. I'll start with you.
Thank you, first of all, for your work and for your newest book. I'm wondering, what is the first action that you took in your life to change your own relationship to food, whatever that meant to you at the time? And what was going on in your life that precipitated that?
I mean, it's such a common story, but of course, being a writer, I made a book out of it. I was in my mid-50s. I had been pretty healthy. I'm a runner, blah, blah. And suddenly all of the numbers that afflict middle-aged people went in the wrong direction, as they often do. And I just decided, I'm going to make this story as fast as I can. I just decided I needed some rules to eat less junk food, to eat fewer animal products, and to increase my consumption of fruits and vegetables. And to be clear, I have pretty much 100% control over what I eat. That's not true of everybody, but I not only do my own shopping, I do my own cooking. I'm almost all the time. So for me, this was pretty straightforward. And I invented this diet called Vegan Before 6, where I eat like a maniac before 6. I only eat fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and whole grains and beans. And then at 6, I do whatever I want. And that has worked for me. But the point is that if you have the luxury of controlling your own diet, you just need some rules that say, I'm going to make the bulk of my diet be fresh food. That's pretty much as simple as that.
All right, thank you. Sir?
I've heard venture capitalists say that we're on the verge of animal-free meat, and they just say it's a foregone conclusion. 10, 20 years from now, we won't need cows anymore. Is this a good idea?
Well, it's debatable for sure, and we don't know about resource use for animal-free meat, and we don't know about sustainability of animal-free meat, and we don't know about nutrition of animal-free meat. So what we know about animal-free meat, very good term, by the way, most people don't use that. Well, I say fake meat, but this is better, actually. What we don't know about animal-free meat is so much that it's hard to say what the future is. Right now, it's junk food. It's ultra-processed food. You can't make it at home. I mean, I can tell you how to make a really awesome bean burger at home, but I can't tell you how to make an impossible burger at home because it can't be done, because it's super highly processed food of ingredients that you can't possibly produce yourself. So how is that stuff on the environment? How is that stuff in terms of sustainability? How is that stuff in terms of human nutrition? The answers aren't there yet. So I don't think so. But I'd be okay with being wrong, but the product has to be better than it is now.
Hi. I'm very interested in, the personal responsibility aspects of this, but I'm also wondering whether you could speak about whether there are organizations that are working on this issue, probably nonprofits, that you feel are strategically capable of making a difference?
I mean, I have a pat answer for that question because I have a favorite organization, and it's called HEAL, and it's HEAL Alliance, and it's Health, Environment, Agriculture, Labor Alliance, HEAL. And it's a union of unions. It's an organization of organizations, and there are 50 or 60 organizations in it, and they range from Pioneer Valley Workers Center here in Massachusetts, which organizes agricultural workers in the Connecticut River Valley, to a Union of Concerned Scientists, to all the others that are slipping my mind, but they're involved in improved nutrition for people, protecting the environment, labor issues in food, agriculture. And it's kind of like a mutual fund of food groups. It's like if you're going to send $50 to someone, that's who to send it to, because it's going to get spent well. I mean, there are a zillion people doing good work in food in the United States, everywhere. I mean, right here too, so.
And I'm guessing this is going to be our last question, Nancy? What do you think? Oh, we have 3 more minutes, so we'll see if it's our last question.
Hi, I just wanted to go back to something that Danielle mentioned, and that's eating disorders. There's a huge minority of Americans that are purposefully starving themselves to death, and that here empty calories are bad and internalized as all calories are bad. So how do we lead the crusade against overeating and obesity without demonizing food itself and making it seem like food is the enemy?
I mean, I think part of that is answering the question, what is food for? Thinking about food as nourishment, thinking about food as being as close to, that food that's close to its source, that's food that's recognizable as food, is good. And there is a distinction between that and food that's not good. So it does require some judgment, but, as you're no doubt more aware than I, this distinction is not always made as well as it should be. But the distinction's real. It's not that food is bad. It's that American junk food is bad. Real food is great.
All right. And yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because, orthorexia is a growing problem where people who hear this, the emphasis on healthy food, use it to starve themselves in, ever more complicated and horrible ways. We have one more? Great.
Oh,
Terrific.
okay. So you said, everybody brings a different perspective to this conversation. So for this particular question, the perspective is around the role of the multinational corporation in the global food industrial complex. And as we speak, the WBCSD they're all meeting in Europe to talking about this very issue, and particularly this one methodology called the true value of food. And I was wondering, what you know about it, what you think about it as a tool and a concept to sort of help executives think through.
I mean, true cost of food is a really smart concept. It basically means let's take into account everything, all the costs that go into producing food. And those are agricultural, their social justice costs, their environmental costs, their climate change costs, and so on. And when you do that, all of the advantages of junk food disappear. But it's a complicated intellectual process. And if you were to price food what it really costs, then yes, real food, sustainable food would be less expensive than junk food. But we are subsidizing junk food, and part of that is hiding its true cost. So it sort of goes back to what I said before. Unsubsidized junk food, start subsidizing good food, and we come closer to a place where we're showing what the true cost of food is.
Well, thank you all so much for coming and
Perfect
joining us
timing.
for this great
Thank you.
conversation.
Great job. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much again
glad
to Danielle and Mark and all the great questions. We'll be back here again at 1:45 with Patricia Sullivan and Lawrence O'Donnell. Please hit the book tent and support the authors. Thank you.